The epistle reading this morning is from the second chapter of the second book, rather, of Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. We're picking up the narrative here in chapter 3 of verse 12. And this is a very interesting text because it's a text in which the Apostle Paul is reinterpreting the text that we just heard from Exodus 34 about Moses and his veil, reinterpreting it for a Jewish Christian community. And what we'll see here is this sort of internal debate that's happening within the early Christian community, which in the 50s when Paul was writing is still primarily Jewish. And if you don't know that, this particular text could be taken in a very anti-Semitic way. So what we need to understand is that this is really the internal debate that's happening within Judaism about how Jesus is to be understood. So let us listen to God's word. Paul said, "Since we have such a hope, we are very bold, not like Moses, who put a veil over his face so that the Israelites might not see the end of the fading splendor. But their minds were hardened, for to this day, when they read the Old Covenant, that same veil remains uplifted, because only through Christ is it taken away. Yes, to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their minds, but when a man turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being changed into his likeness from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. Therefore, having this ministry by the mercy of God, we do not lose heart. We have renounced disgraceful, underhanded ways. We refuse to practice cunning or to tamper with God's word. But by the open statement of the truth, we would commend ourselves to every man's conscience in the sight of God." So we move from Paul writing in the 50s of the first century to the gospel writer Luke in chapter 9, who was probably writing sometime in the late 80s, more than 30 years later. A text in which the imagery of Exodus 34 is also embraced. In fact, this particular text of the Transfiguration is modeled on Exodus 34. Now, to Christian people today, when we hear this text, we say, oh, here's the gospel writer talking about the divinity of Jesus. And that is true in a certain respect. But what the writer in its historical context rather, is really saying, this Jesus, he is the new Moses. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his countenance was altered, and his raiment became a dazzling white. And behold, 2 men talked with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was to accomplish at Jerusalem. And Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep, and when they wakened, they saw his glory and the 2 men who stood with him. And as the men were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is well that we are here. Let us make 3 booths, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. As he said this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silence and told no one in those days anything of what they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met him, and behold, a man from the crowd cried, "Teacher, I beg you to look upon my son, for he is my only child." And behold, a spirit seizes him, and he suddenly cries out. It convulses him till he foams and shatters him and will hardly leave him. And I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, "Oh, faithless and perverse generation, how long am I to be with you and to bear with you? bring your son here. While he was coming, the demon tore him and convulsed him, but Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit and healed the boy and gave him back to his father. And all were astonished at the majesty of God. And this is the gospel of the Lord. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to travel to Grand Rapids, Michigan, and to visit one of the leading progressive churches in the country, the Fountain Street Church, which is a downtown congregation right in the heart of the city of Grand Rapids. Now, one of the interesting things about this church is that it has a lot of similarities to this congregation. It was built at the latter part, the beginning of the 20th century. It grew out of the social gospel movement, and the architecture of the church reflects that movement in many interesting ways. And perhaps the most poignant way that is reflected is in the stained glass in that particular congregation. There are 9 beautiful Tiffany stained glass windows that depict the values that this congregation has stood for more than 100 years. One part of the sanctuary, which is this beautiful kind of Italian Rococo style, are 3 beautiful Tiffany windows, one of Moses, one of Elijah. Who is the third? My brain is stopping. Moses, Elijah. Oh, Jesus. That was a joke, by the way. Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. In another part of the building, there are 3 windows that reflect their commitment to democratic values. Pictures of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and President Lincoln. And then, interestingly, in the third part of the building, in a very prominent way, are 3 windows that I think are really powerful. There's a window dedicated to Isaac Newton, to Galileo, and to Charles Darwin. Now, I asked the pastor, Fred Wooten, I said, which part of this beautiful sanctuary, and it's stunningly beautiful, I said, which part of the sanctuary do your people really appreciate the most? And without hesitation, he said, it's the Charles Darwin window. I was stunned. I said, Charles Darwin, why? And he said, because it communicates not only to them, but to the community, that this is a church that embraces truth wherever it comes from. Embracing truth wherever it comes from. You may not have been aware of it, but this is Evolution Weekend across America and across the world. This particular Sunday, for at least the past 10 years or so, has been a Sunday where thousands of congregations, churches nationwide and around the world pay homage to Charles Darwin, his theory of the origin of the species by means of natural selection, and the affirmation that the timeless truths of the Bible and other scriptures may comfortably coexist with the discoveries of modern science. Today I'm joining perhaps 15,000 other priests and ministers and rabbis and imams in signing what's called the clergy letter that makes this affirmation. It goes on to say this: we do not read the Bible literally as one would a science textbook. Rather, we believe that religious truth is of a different order from scientific truth. Its purpose is not to convey scientific information, but to transform hearts. We believe that the theory of evolution is a foundational scientific truth, one that has stood up to rigorous scrutiny and upon which much of human knowledge and achievement rests. To reject this truth or to treat it as one theory among others is to deliberately embrace scientific ignorance and to transmit such ignorance to our children. I want you to think about this in terms of a film that came out about 3 years ago. It came out in 2009. It's titled Creation. It's about Charles Darwin and his life. It didn't get wide distribution in local theaters. I think it was at Hollywood 14 here for 2 days. But it's a very powerful film. You can watch it on Netflix. It had some really good reviews in newspapers like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the LA Times. It describes how Darwin wrote his revolutionary book on the origin of species while facing strong opposition from his devoutly Christian wife, Emma, and while in deep grief over the death of his oldest daughter, Anne. So what was it exactly that Darwin thought about God back there in the mid-19th century, and how might we speak of that in the church today, more than a decade into the 21st century? Back in 1828, Darwin was a young man. He was born in 1809. February 12th of this year, he'll be 203. He went to Cambridge with the intention of becoming an Anglican priest. His studies were primarily in theology and philosophy and the classics, and he started out with what we would call a conservative Christian view that about 6,000 years ago the world was created by God exactly as it is now. Ultimately, he was convinced by the scientific evidence which he amassed and gathered from others that the earth and all life existing upon it evolved very slowly without any supernatural intervention over the course of 4.5 billion years. In his studies at Cambridge, Darwin was particularly impressed by the Reverend William Paley's book, Natural Theology, which was published in 1802. Darwin describes it in his autobiography as one of the most influential books in his intellectual development. It used science to prove the existence of God and to demonstrate God's attributes. Paley attempted to reconcile science and religion, explaining the laws of nature were literally the reflection of God's mind. His natural theology required no leaps of faith, no suspensions of disbelief. There was no resort to miracles. There was no claim of divine revelation. Darwin, by contrast, had entered college saying that he didn't in the least way doubt the strict and literal truth of any word in the Bible, and that I persuaded myself that our creed must be fully accepted. By the time he was writing Origin of Species in earnest in the 1850s, he considered himself a deist. That is, he believed in a God who created the universe and established its natural laws, but has since intervened but has not rather since intervened or interfered with its functioning. Now, I want you to notice here how he describes the evolutionary process in that book by reference to a creator God who generated natural laws at the beginning of time. This is what he said. To my mind, it accords better with what we know of the laws impressed on matter by the Creator, that we view all beings, not as special creations, but as the lineal descendants of some few beings which lived long before the first bed of the Silurian system was deposited. It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the deep earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other and dependent on each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. There is grandeur in this view of life, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. And that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. What is so apparently compelling in the movie about Darwin, though, is how personal the struggle with his changing faith was within his own family. He left Cambridge in 1831, and then he spent 5 years on the HMS Beagle doing geological and biological research literally all the way around the world. In 1839, when he'd already largely developed his theory of natural selection. He married his cousin, Emma Wedgwood, who was a devoutly devout traditional Christian. His internal struggle between his church training and his new theological perspective was intensified by his external struggles with his wife, and his personal health was affected, making him at times a physical invalid. He was, in fact, so concerned that if he published his theory, not only would it affect his family relationships, it would also challenge, of course, established religion of the time and put him at risk of being a social outcast. And so he delayed publication for more than 20 years, and he might have delayed even more if Alfred Russel Wallace had not written an essay with a strikingly similar theory and sent it to Darwin. The movie Creation centers on the relationship between Darwin's loss of traditional Christian faith and the death of his beloved older daughter, Annie. He is haunted, paralyzed, especially as his wife Emma pushes him on what the origin of the species means for his departed daughter and her mother's conviction that the girl's soul lives on eternally. Darwin also has to face other conflicting external pressures as the biologist Thomas Huxley encourages him to publish and a local minister exhorts him not to. It's likely that the most important theological question for Darwin actually was the problem of evil. This is probably how his thought process went. If there is an all-loving and all-powerful God, how could that God allow his sweet, bright, and beautiful daughter to die? John Milton's Paradise Lost was one of Darwin's favorite pieces of literature, and he carried a copy with him throughout his 5 years on the Beagle. Its main purpose could be said to address the problem of evil, to justify the ways of God to humanity, stated in the first book of his epic poem. Milton's solution seemed to be that God needed to let human beings have the autonomy, the free will, to choose between good and evil by themselves. But natural evil from so-called acts of God were much more difficult for Darwin to rationalize. He asked himself, why would God allow for natural disasters like earthquakes or deaths of 10-year-olds from scarlet fever or tuberculosis? As Darwin learned more and more about nature, he increasingly saw it as inefficient at best and downright brutal at worst. This was particularly true in the realm of biology. As he wrote a friend, there seems to me too much misery in the world. I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipresent God would have designedly created the parasitic wasp with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars, or that the cat should play with mice. How could an all-good God create such a gritty reality? But here, the deist approach could work. God is distanced from immediate natural evils, and having set up natural laws at the time of creation, which are now running their course, God could have created the world, but ever since, it has run according to impersonal natural laws that appear to produce natural evil along with natural good. Darwin's unique solution in the realm of biology was to posit that natural selection operates in an unguided fashion on biological diversity. Darwin was far from the only one in his era to struggle with the question of natural suffering and the apparent unfairness of nature itself. In 1849, Alfred Lord Tennyson produced a striking poem which you may have read. It's titled In Memoriam. It's a poem that mourns the death of one of his friends. And unlike many of the nature-loving romantic poets of the time, Tennyson describes natural evil with a very clear eye. Here it is. Are God and nature then at strife that nature lends such evil dreams, so careful of the tight she seems, so careless of the single life, that I, considering everywhere her secret meaning in her deeds, and finding that of 50 seeds she often brings but one to bear. So careful of the type, but no. Stark cliff and quarried stone, she cries 1,000 types are gone. I care for nothing and shall go. Who trusted God was love indeed, and love, creation's final law. Though nature, red in tooth and claw with ravine, shrieked against his creed. Many people at the time, though, even as they might have distanced God from the evils resulting from the operation of natural law, still felt that God must be kept within view, to account for morality, our stronger inner sense of right and wrong. So they spoke of love in the human realm as creation's final law, as did Tennyson. For Christians, it was noted, Jesus can bridge the gap between impersonal natural law and the law of human love, which can redeem some of the apparent brutality of the universe. Jesus lived among us in human form, filled with the spirit of love, said to come from God, exemplifying our weaknesses as well as our strengths, and suffering through temptations and facing a cruel death himself. After 40 days in the wilderness, Jesus is famished, but is able to say that we do not live by bread alone. He is tempted to try to defy the law of gravity, but he responds, do not put the Lord your God to the test. As he dies on the cross, he reaches out in love, even to his executioners. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. From a modern perspective, we might say that human beings have evolved through Darwinian natural selection as a species with a deep moral sense that has proven adaptive for us. This has become, in effect, a dimension of natural law from the human perspective or through the human lens. Therefore, we seek at our best ways to end suffering among people and even sometimes for animals. And we seek to blunt the effects of suffering produced in the world of nature by natural forces like wind and water, earth and fire, or even snow, as we've seen this past weekend. We generate stories and myths and collect them into holy books to teach our children and to remind ourselves, both of how to respond to the great forces of nature and also how to treat each other in a morally attentive way. We generate great religious art and music and architecture and drama for the same purposes. Listen to the anthems that are produced for Christmas and Easter. Look around even this church at its stained glass and its architecture. Darwin has presented the world with much more than a scientific theory. He has given us a new way to look at life itself, and it requires a rethinking of religious understanding as well, as Galileo, for instance, required and didn't succeed at, in challenging the biblical claim that the earth lies at the center of the universe. The account in Genesis of a world that was created by God in 6 days, including 2 for all animals to be brought forth and for a human male and female to be made to have dominion over them. It's wonderful poetry and filled with theological depth and imagery. But it's simply wrong as an account of scientific reality. It does violence to the text to try to make it say something that it was never intended to say. Christianity needs to get better at relating science and religion, taking a page from what the Dalai Lama said when he visited the United States back in 2005. He was asked what would happen if modern science discovers something at odds with Buddhist belief. And his response was immediate. He said, of course, we would have to change our Buddhist beliefs. Darwin continued to struggle to reconcile science and religion throughout his life. He always denied that he was an atheist, but ultimately he became happiest with the label agnostic. And this is what he wrote in his autobiography. He said, I gradually came to disbelieve in traditional Christianity as divine revelation, but I was very unwilling to give up my belief. Source of conviction in the existence of God, connected with the reason and not with the feelings, impresses me, as does the extreme difficulty, or rather impossibility, of conceiving of this immense and wonderful universe, including man with his capacity of looking far backward and far into the future as the result of blind chance or necessity. And thus, reflecting, I feel compelled to look at to a first cause having an intelligent mind in some degree analogous to that of man. And I deserve to be called a theist. This conclusion was strong in my mind at the time, as far as I can remember, when I wrote The Origin of Species. And it is since that time that it has rather gradually, with many fluctuations, become weaker. And I, for one, must be content to remain an agnostic. Of course, there are many modern Darwinists who call themselves atheists, including best-selling authors like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett. But there are others like the geneticist Francis Collins, who's the leader of the Human Genome Project and now the head of the National Institutes of Health, who are committed Christians and say that evolution is simply God's method of creation. Stanford professor of biological sciences and geophysics, Joan Roughgarden, writes similarly in her wonderful book, Evolution and Christian Faith. She understands that God creates the world according to a plan that continues to unfold in the fullness of time through the natural processes that science studies. Some of you may be surprised to discover that Darwin is buried in the most important church in England, Westminster Abbey. This is what the Dean of Westminster said at the time when he was asked if it was okay for Darwin to be buried there. The Dean of Westminster, George Granville Bradley, was away in France when he received a telegram forwarded from the President of the Royal Society of London saying, it would be acceptable to a very large number of our fellow countrymen of all classes and opinions that our illustrious countryman, Mr. Darwin, should be buried in Westminster Abbey. The Dean recalled, I did not hesitate as to my answer and telegraphed directly that my assent would be cheerfully given. And then this is what another clergy person, the Bishop of Carlisle, said at a memorial service for Darwin a week after his funeral. Although an agnostic, Darwin was greatly respected by his contemporaries, said Harvey Goodwin, the Bishop of Carlisle, in a memorial sermon preached in the Abbey on the Sunday following the funeral. I think that the internment of the remains of Mr. Darwin in Westminster Abbey is in accordance with the judgment of the wisest of his countrymen. It would have been unfortunate if anything had occurred to give weight and currency to the foolish notion which some have diligently propagated, but for which Mr. Darwin was not responsible, that there is a necessary conflict between a knowledge of nature and a belief in God. And so, my friends, as we celebrate this evolution weekend, let the light, as one hymn says, let the light and truth suffuse the mind. Let what we know be redefined through science and scholarship, and let the gift of gathered light pervade the ways we learn and know awaken wonder and delight, while knowledge, truth, and wisdom grow. Just one final thought. I want to go back to my experience at the Fountain Street Church in Grand Rapids. The Fountain Street Church exists in a community not unlike Topeka, Kansas. It's a very conservative community, and yet this liberal church is a beacon of light in that community, and it is growing, and they have more than 100 children under the age of 12 in their church school. And I asked Fred Wheaton why. And he said, well, quite by accident, a number of years ago, we did a television commercial that featured our Darwin window. It has been the best evangelistic tool that we have ever used. Why? Because it communicated to that community that you didn't have to check your brain at the door. Let us pray. Well, Lord our God, as we read in the psalm this morning, you are a God who communicates us through your creation, through nature. And it has been only in recent years that we've come to a fuller understanding of how the creation has unfolded. Lord, help us to willingly embrace what is true about the world in which we live in, and help us to communicate to others that there is no inherent conflict in what we experience of you through nature and what we know about the world to be true. We ask it in your name. Amen.